Hey everyone, welcome back. It's great to see you. Today we're going to talk about Dragon Quest VIII, Journey of the Cursed King. This game came out in North America in 2005 and pretty legendary. It's developed by Level 5 and published by Square Enix. And Dragon Quest is an interesting series from the lens of it's incredibly popular in Japan. I mean, just to speak to the sales units, within, I believe, the first week, this game sold 3 million copies in Japan, whereas in the United States, it went on to sell something like 500K. So the most interesting thing to me about it is that it never saw the level of popularity and hype that something like Final Fantasy did when it was localized and brought to North America. Now, what I find particularly interesting on that front is that later on, Nintendo would go to publish many of the Dragon Quest games on the Nintendo DS. So that was, I think they did 4, 5, 6, 9, I believe. And then unfortunately, we never got 10 here in the States. It's Japan exclusive still, and it's an MMO, which I thought was a weird change of pace for the series, being that they're not known for that. And then, of course, Dragon Quest XI came out. So I have a bit of history with this series because I grew up playing a ton of Nintendo DS games, and Dragon Quest seemed to be a good alternative to Pokemon if you wanted something like that on the DS. And so I picked the games up. I ended up really enjoying them, and then this was always seen as the cream of the crop. I think it's one of the best-selling PlayStation 2 titles in Japan to have ever existed. Not only that, but it is a beloved franchise with some iconic characters that even people who don't know Dragon Quest know the characters, like the slime. Like everyone knows what the slime is. And so I've had this for a handful of years. I thought the length of it was going to be pretty intimidating, and so I stayed away from playing it for a while. But here we are. I played it, I beat it, and I'm excited to talk about it. And so first thing I wanted to talk about was just the packaging of this. As you can tell, this is kind of a bit of an old box. It's kind of torn up and ripped a little bit, but the contents on the inside are what's really fun. So this thing, if you can tell on the side here, is just, it's chunky. It really is. And that's because there's a playable demo disc for Final Fantasy XII included. And this was a big part of the selling point for Dragon Quest VIII when it came out here in the US. So not only do you have that disc, I have the game disc, and then we also have a couple of manuals in here, which let's take a look at those if I can get them out. So firstly, we have a manual for the Final Fantasy XII playable demo, and there's a little bit of information in here on some of the areas you'll visit, the Fawn Coast it looks like, and the Still Shrine of Miriam, which I think are pretty early on parts of the game, maybe like the first 10 hours or so, and a little bit of the controls and the battle system and how it works. And this was very cool, I thought, because I've played through Final Fantasy XII, the Zodiac Age, and I can only imagine that on the tail end of, 10 and then 11, there was probably a lot of hype for the game at the time. And then we have this very thick booklet for Dragon Quest VIII, and this booklet goes through all sorts of things, from the world map, the prologue, and kind of what's happening in the story. We learn a little bit about all of the different heroes involved in our quest, a little bit about how to explore and look around the map and so on. And a big reason why they had to discuss so many of these factors in the game is that there were a lot of changes for Dragon Quest VIII that the series had yet to see. One of the biggest ones being that this game is it's 3D open world, essentially, where as the character, you are very up close on the world map, and you're running around and you're going to, the towns and the caves and the dungeons and exploring all these various areas, whereas in, RPGs prior, you would have been kind of this top-down overview, and especially all the Dragon Quest games were always the top-down overview. So when they changed it to this, they really brought the perspective in a little closer and made it feel like more of an adventure. And it wasn't just in the exploration. They do this in, say, the battle system, where the battle systems changed from this total first-person perspective. how it used to be to, first person when you're choosing what moves or skills or attacks you're going to do, and then changing it to third person so that animations can play out. You can see your characters attacking, so on and so forth. Before we get too far into that and all the gameplay side, the development of this game was pretty interesting. We had Hori kind of leading the front again, and he'd been with the Dragon Quest series for a while. And you have Akira Toriyama, iconic, Dragon Ball guy, coming back to help design the characters for this. And actually, the highlight for me in this whole thing is Sugiyama and his compositions. They're incredible. Not only are the compositions incredible, but for the North America release, the music that was used was all composed, recorded, and then put in the game by the Tokyo Metropolitan Symphony Orchestra, I believe. And the music is just incredible from front to back, whether it's the battle song that you're going to hear 652,814 times, or the various melodies and harmonies that you'll pick up going into towns, and whether that's the quiet and peaceful times or the rush of a dungeon. The music is, for me, the highlight of this game. It's beautiful, it's incredible, and from what I've heard, if you play the 3DS version of Dragon Quest VIII, you get this more sequenced, synthesizer-based music, and it just doesn't hold up to what this game accomplishes. And so from that lens, this review is all about the PlayStation 2 version, and I've heard there's been a number of quality of life changes for the 3DS. So some of the things I'll bring up, pros and cons, perhaps will be a little different if you decide you're going to play this on the 3DS or have played on the 3DS and have opinions about it. But one thing that's static between the two is the story. And so where the story starts, you are the hero, and you have been accompanied by a little monster guy, and he actually is a king, and he is essentially on a mission to find this jester, and the jester had done something to his kingdom which caused it to fall into disarray, and so they're trying to catch the jester to fix that. And that jester's name is Dulmagus, and Dulmagus stole a staff from the castle of Tredain, and it caused basically this curse to be released, at least thought to be a curse of the time, and returning the staff is the quest. They're really stopping Dulmagus. And so as the hero with Trode, the king, and your, mercenary for hire, Yangus, you'll venture across the continent, picking up some party members along the way, such as Jessica, whose brother was killed by Dulmagus, and Angelo, who he's a Templar knight and kind of the high priest, the leader of their order, was murdered by Dulmagus. And so you have all these characters coming together for very personal reasons that you'll experience throughout the story to catch up to and defeat Dulmagus. And that's only the first half of the story, and catching Dulmagus is really where I think the story for me reaches a lot of its conclusions. That'll usually happen for most people around the 35 to 40 hour time frame of this game, but the game is more like an 80-hour experience. And so past that, what happens is once Dulmagus has been defeated, Jessica will pick up the staff and become corrupted, and then you'll defeat her, and then a dog will pick up the staff and become corrupted, and then you'll defeat him. And then Marcello, who you'll come to know as a character later on, picks up the staff, and then he becomes corrupted and defeated. And it turns out that it takes a while for the party to figure out, oh, well, defeating Dulmagus didn't fix the curse. Oh, it's actually the staff. And oh, the staff actually has one of the most evil demon creatures to have ever existed. Its soul is trapped in there, and so we need to defeat that demon creature named Rapthorn. And so there's a lot that happens after defeating Dulmagus. I would say from the lens of the writing for this game that a lot of the high notes become concluded when Dulmagus is dead. essentially. And it's funny because there's a part where Jessica remarks, defeating Dulmagus I thought would lift the curse and, help bring things to normal. But I realized that it wasn't Dulmagus that had really, started on this path of the death of my brother. It was actually the staff itself. And so now I'm realizing, we have to go after and destroy the staff. But I felt like some of the justifications that they wanted to kind of push the story back through after that point kind of meandered, because, you're going through this rigmarole of, we'll chase this guy, we'll chase this dog, we'll chase this other dude. And I think that the story kind of falters at that point. But overall, I'd say the point leading up to Dulmagus is very exciting and adventurous, and you feel like it's your first time traversing lots of the world, and you're doing it on foot, or you're riding a saber cat and really exploring. And then the latter half, you're mostly just running fetch quest missions and flying around on a bird to get to and fro, or just zooming back and forth between places you've been a handful of times. And so I feel like some of the momentum really slows down for me at that point, and kind of lagged in a couple ways. But the story does conclude in a fantastic way with a grand wedding and a ton of drama. Actually, there's a whole story piece that plays out without any fighting for like the last half hour or an hour of the game, which I thought was pretty fun. And some of those final battles really feel epic, and you really feel like you've come so far, gone so far to be here. And so I thought that the writers did a good job of kind of putting a bow on things and making you feel very fulfilled. But a big part of Dragon Quest is not in the cutscenes, not in the story, but in the gameplay. And kind of your standard gameplay loop you'll see with Dragon Quest is you're in a town, you buy weapons and armor that you think are interesting. There's some sort of plot point in the town. XYZ happened, or someone's cursed, or there's this thing going on. And you kind of get your marching orders to go to this dungeon, or go to this cave nearby, or and defeat the bad thing at the end of the cave. And you do exactly that. And so since you're traveling on the overworld, there's a lot of exploration that can be done along the way. There are so many things hidden, chests, monsters that you can catch for the monster arena, which allows you to basically collect and use monsters in your fights. And the first 15-20 hours of the game, you're not even gonna have a map. And so a lot of this traversal can be kind of annoying, but then later on, once you get the map, it still doesn't really tell you a whole lot about what's out there to be found. So for somebody who's not playing this without a guide, not playing this without a strategy guide, say back in the day when those were popular, I don't know how you would have found a lot of these objects. Not that they're always necessary, but there are some really good things that you can only discover and only pick up that are hidden on the overworld. And then a lot of these objects that you will find will be used for alchemy. And so alchemy is also a big part of this game, where you can basically take 2-3 items, put them in a pot, and then create better items with them, or items with different properties. Such as every once in a while, and this was really frustrating, there's a couple dungeons where you'll pick up a really nice piece of armor, and then you'll put it on one of your characters, and suddenly they're cursed. And when they're cursed, they're 50-50 useless in a battle. And so I found that could be pretty frustrating. But you can get something called the Saint's Ashes, which you can combine in the alchemy pot to produce an item which is no longer going to apply curse to your characters. And so, little factors like that are pretty cool. But the hard thing about alchemy is there is a time delay. So you have to put items in, and then you have to wait, usually 10-15 minutes of gameplay time before that item's actually ready for use. And that's one thing you're going to notice across Dragon Quest VIII, is there's a lot of downtime. Whether it's putting things in the alchemy pot, or little things like traversing and loading screens, or fighting, things can get really drawn out. There's later on in the game, you'll fight these characters called Caped Caperers, and in a couple dungeons they'll show up in a pack of 8 or 9. And this can be really frustrating, because when you choose all of your moves, the game can take a few seconds at a time to play out an animation for a character. So, your character hits, another character hits, performs a move, does a spell, but then there's also 9 enemies that are also taking their turns and doing things. And so when you're fighting, even these low-level monsters that show up in these big packs, even the smallest fight that's not going to award you a ton in terms of experience or gold, can really wind up the clock. And I think it's funny that if you look at the completion times between the 3DS version and the PlayStation 2 version, one of the things you're going to notice is people completed a lot quicker on the 3DS version. And I think a big part of that is just the pace of play. Like, things have just been sped up and made faster through quality of life, updates. And I think that's really good for those folks playing it on a handheld. But it is frustrating on the PlayStation 2 how just long and dragged out things feel because of that. And couple that with really high encounter rates, whether you're in the overworld or in dungeons, and you can be walking every handful of steps and then be running into a monster. And so it really slows down the gameplay quite a bit, and that's why it's 50 hours on 3DS maybe, whereas it's 80 to get through a standard run on the PS2. And another hard thing about the gameplay that I found frustrating is that Dragon Quest VIII is very dependent on your luck and your RNG, and you better be praying the whole time to the RNG gods, please just be on my side for this one, because so many times the simplest fights can become frustrating due to just an inability to get the right spells out, an inability to land on timing of moves, and so on and so forth. And I'll give you a great example. We were talking about the Caped Caperers, and I'll talk about another fighter, which is like basically a swordsman. He looks like a rooster. I cannot remember his name. Sorry about that. One of them does Screech. One of them makes your characters fall down through dancing. And so I go in this dungeon. These enemies are very low level at this point compared to my team. And when you start the fight, all characters have agility, and agility somewhat determines the order of moves, but it's not foolproof. Like, your fastest character may sometimes move last. And so we go in the fight, and immediately one of these roosters lets out an intimidating scream. And of course it's going to knock over all but one character in my party. And then the Caped Caperer goes and does a dance. And then of course it's going to knock over my final. And then of course they have this like claw guy on their team. And he's flying through the air and he's hitting everybody, doing 100 damage at a time. And my whole team's just getting knocked over. And I'm like, what the hell? I can't do anything. And so one of my teammates dies. And so I cast Zing on them. And he casts Zing to bring him back to life. And then they just lay on the ground dead, and says, oh, Jessica did not return to life. And I'm like, what the hell? I could have defeated these enemies no problem at all under any other circumstances, except now it's just been decided that, oh, I'm going to screw you on this one and make sure that you just get totally owned by this group of enemies. And so I found that it was interesting from the lens of Dragon Quest has always been marketed as a very simple, straightforward battle system where you can just jump in and dive in, but it is one that requires a lot of mastering in order to play very proficiently. And when you get towards the ending parts of the game, and some of the boss battles, such as Red Horn and Blue Fang, I think is what they're called, the game is truly attempting to punish you. And I would say that at some points it felt pretty unfair. I was able to get through it, but when you go into these fights and then you realize, okay, I guess I'm going to go grind metal slimes for 2 or 3 hours, is the game that fun? Especially when the pace of play is holding you back from really jumping and diving through those moments effectively. And I found times when I just had to pop on a podcast and grind out a few levels for my characters. And that's something that in 2005 was more in line with the JRPG experience in terms of, oh, well, sometimes you're just going to have to do that to bring your levels up to effectively fight. But in 2023, it does present a more frustrating avenue for players, and I can understand why people would feel that way. So by the end of the game, when I got to Rapthorn and I defeated the final bosses, I was pretty tired, I'll be honest. I really felt like the length of the game was getting to me. It was testing my patience, and it's unfortunate. I think a big part of it too is that I've played so many of the Dragon Quest games, this one being probably the 5th or 6th that I've beaten. And the Dragon Quest games are very formulaic. They all have kind of a similar story. They all have the exact same enemies. They all have the same gameplay loop, whether it's top world, 3D, behind the character, it doesn't matter. And so I think that there was definitely a fatigue of this series, just maybe due to the nature of how many I've played. But overall, you chalk past the gameplay. Again, I was talking about how I love the sound in this game, the music, and I love the aspects of navigating. The world is huge and magnificent, and at parts a little generic. Some areas, like say the southeastern continent, you're just gonna mull through a couple areas and then not touch it, and you're just gonna see tons of forests and a couple mountains in the background. But it's really cool how things scale up from you just being one person out on the road to you riding a saber cat, if you do it at Chateau Filet, to then flying through the skies on a bird or sailing across the oceans. It really feels like a grand adventure across a world. And so that's one thing that I think a lot of JRPGs don't capture nearly as effectively as a game like Dragon Quest VIII can. So you have your pros and cons. I think the game is probably a great experience on the 3DS because it sounds like a lot of the things that I've found kind of frustrating about the game have been alleviated. But at the same time, it's really fun to experience it in such a classic form. The last thing I did want to touch on was the graphics and the visual style. Again, Akira Toriyama did all the character designs, and it really shows. I think every character in this game is unique looking and interesting and funny. And not only that, but the world itself has that presentation as well. And it's done in this 3D cel-shaded art style. So it still feels very cartoony, very Dragon Quest, so to speak. And I think that this look and this design would really go on to inspire what we see in future titles too. So I think from that lens, Dragon Quest VIII was a big and pivotal moment for the franchise as a whole, and also for really securing this 3D art style we would go to see in, like, say, Dragon Quest XI, for instance. And I also wanted to hammer on the characters. Not only are the characters visually interesting, I think Yangus being the funniest one and looking hilarious when you're playing as him on the world map, but they're all written pretty well, and their stories conclude in happy ways and in fulfilling ways, I'll say. And so, again, not to add a little bit more to the writing, I do think that it was very effective from that lens. Okay, so that's a little bit about the game, a little bit about the story. Story, pretty decent, kind of falls off halfway through for me. Gameplay, a little slow at times, fun in other ways, especially in how you navigate and experience the world. The music, incredible, probably one of the best soundtracks ever to be around. And the graphics and visual art and style, especially playing it on a PlayStation 2 and really getting that old school experience, really enjoyed it. So anyways, that's my thoughts on the game. Pick it up. I would probably recommend for someone, whether they're familiar with Dragon Quest or not, perhaps play the 3DS version. I think you'll get a more holistic experience out of it. The only thing you're going to miss out on, unfortunately, is that incredible Tokyo Metropolitan Symphony Orchestra based soundtrack. But otherwise, I think you'll have a great experience. Have you played Dragon Quest VIII? Would love to hear your thoughts on it. And if you liked the video, please like the video. And otherwise, hope you subscribe and stick around to chat about games with me. Until then, hope you all have a great day and chat with you later.